Right, everyone. My name is Eileen Gallagher, and I'm the Chair of Trustees of the LGBT Alliance. So thank you all very much for coming here this morning. And of course, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce my good friend and a hugely successful, let's count them, diversity consultant, broadcaster, comedian and author. I'm sure there's even more, is Mr. Simon Fanshawe. Now, Simon is not long back from the Edinburgh Fringe this year with his stand-up act, which he hadn't done for 20 years, and you revived 30 years, and you're showing your age, Simon. Of course, back in the day, Simon won the coveted Perrier Award for comedy, so he's pretty good at that as well. Simon, as you probably know, was one of the co-founders of Stonewall, and he worked tirelessly for that organisation in the days when Stonewall was the charity for standing up for the rights for lesbians, gays and bisexuals. Now, of course, that's a job of the OBE Alliance. Simon, who is a great friend of the Alliance, he now spends much of his time advising companies on how to be real diversity and inclusion in their workplace. Simon is a thoughtful and articulate critic of the current diversity and inclusion industry that, certainly I believe, presently sows more division than harmony in the workplace. With his company, Diversity by Design, Simon helps organisations create real change and not just the typical virtue signalling we're getting at the present. Today, Simon's advice is given free. Obviously, you've bought tickets for the conference, but he's giving his time for free to help us better negotiate the challenges of the workplace. His book, The Power of Difference, was nominated by the Institute of Management for Book of the Year. Congratulations. And is, of course, on sale at the conference and in all good bookshops. Simon told me to say that. I know, Simon, I know that I'm going to enjoy this and you'll enjoy this. But there's things to be learned. After it, I think I want to have some time for questions because I'm sure many of you will be in workplaces as employers or employees or as managers and might have questions for Simon because he's just about met anything. Anyway, Simon, over to you for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much indeed. Gosh. Oh, please. So yeah, I won't go on too long. Often when I do conferences, you know, I speak and there's a pile of feedback forms. And I looked at one the other day, and somebody had written on the feedback form, if I only had an hour left to live in my life, I'd want to spend it listening to a speech by Simon Fanshawe. And there was an asterisk, and I turned to the continuation page, and they'd written, because it would seem like eternity. So I very much hope that you don't feel like that. I don't mind people looking at their watches, but it really pisses me off to see them tapping them to see if they're still working. So if you could stick with that. Just kind of 2 or 3 points to start with, really. I mean, one is the Stonewall question, and I mean, you know, Julie's right. I mean, there was an inbuilt bias in the sense in Stonewall just because we were focusing on the legislative agenda, and as you know, there were no laws about lesbians because it turns out it didn't exist, so that was fine. And so, in a sense, there was a kind of inbuilt bias, and I know that actually it was an interesting alliance to put together of men and women, and I know that lesbians who got involved in Stonewall from the early days had to negotiate some degree of hostility from certain sections of lesbian and feminist movements. But I think what's useful to think back about Stonewall is that between 1989 and when we started and 2014 gay marriage, actually the objective was legislative and social equality. And we used to have this joke, oh, we'll do it by 2000. And in fact, we're 14 years late. We literally did the job. And the interesting thing is, how did we do it? And I say we in the broadest possible sense. I was just involved at the beginning because what happened essentially was that we were at a rather drunken Sunday lunch party at Ian McKellen's, and we thought, well, we'll start a thing. And so we then wrote on a very old computer what we were going to do. And then we looked around the room, we realised that we were 7 men. So we thought, better get some lesbians. So we went to the lesbian shop and got 6. And, that was good. And the deal was that the original group was 10 men, 10 women by standing order. That was built into the structure of the group. But the absolutely key thing about this was, and I think this is true of the workplace too, and I think it's true of politics generally, so that's the lesson I learned from that, is that if you're going to make advances, and particularly if you look at the history of making advances around homosexuality in Britain, they've never been made by talking about homosexuality. They've always been made by talking about bigger principles. So if you look at the Wolfenden report, that was all about the relationship of the law to personal life. And Wolfenden himself said a really interesting thing was, does the state have a role in anybody's morality or immorality? In other words, he wasn't commenting on his view about homosexuality. He was commenting about the role of the law. A 67 Act, again, that was about whether or not the law should be involved in people's personal lives. When we went through the various ban on the military, adoption and fostering, all those things, the way we made progress was by asking bigger questions. What should we do for parents, and how should they be supported, and how can kids be best brought up? Not gay people have a right to have children. We were talking about families. We were talking about an agenda which was about the majority of the population. In the armed forces question, it was always, why would we stop a certain group of people from serving their country? Because actually serving your country, whatever you may or may not think about the politics of war, or whether you're a pacifist or whatever, serving your country in the military is a key building block of the notion of the nation state. So those were bigger questions. And it was always fun. I'm an army brat, so I had great fun. We went on television, and one was always on television with these sort of funny senior army people. And I remember being on television with one of them once, and it was like, the people who were my dad's sort of superior officers. And he said, well, we can't possibly have homosexuals. They always say homosexuals, which I absolutely love. They can't possibly have homosexual men in the army, they said, because, in the more intimate areas, in the showers and so on and so forth, the non-homosexual men, will be very anxious and a little bit nervous. And I said to this guy, do you know what? I really think if what makes you nervous is another guy thinking you've got cute arse, I'm not sure the army's the right job for you. It's the Taliban's coming over the hill, So we had some fun as well as that. But my point is this, is that you can form alliances with people with whom you disagree. Now, I know there's an argument about, and Julie made the very articulate point about the far right or the religious right. Let's be very clear. The far right and the religious right are a separate group of people than necessarily conservatives or liberals or Labour or whatever. I mean, we're talking about people who believe in the democratic process. And you can make alliances with, for instance, Catholics. So if you look at Catholics, there's a whole section of the Catholic Church that takes what my father used to call a rather dim view of homosexuality. Obviously not the priests, but everybody else takes this rather dim view. But you can have an alliance with Catholics because you can say to them, look, do you think it's right for a group of people to be discriminated against as a group? And if you go to Glasgow and Belfast, Catholics understand what that means. So you can make an alliance with them. So that's number one point. I would say that in an organisation, in society, the way you make alliances with people is you find what you have in common. You do not seek total agreement. And at work, what's crucial about that is that you are randomly thrown together at work. You don't choose the people you work with. The only thing you've actually got in common is the objective, selling the trainers or making the widgets or doing the pizza or whatever the hell it is. That's what you've got in common. And what you do is you collaborate with each other through your differences. That's the key thing about work. So I would say there's a principle here which we should apply to politics, and it's true of the battles we're in at the moment. The alliances we have to make decisions. You have to make decisions about who you will or won't ally with, but you've got to decide what you're trying to achieve and who you're going to ally with them, and not demand that total agreement. So that's the first thing.
Do you want me to interrupt you?
Do I want you to interrupt me? No, that's never a good.
My watch.
That's never a good question because the answer will be no. But yes, if you want to, go for it. Don't ask permission.
No, because I think just in terms of a tiny structure, I'd like to get onto the workplace and how that relates. But just staying with the Stonewall thing at the moment, because I think what you said there was really clever, and Stonewall was very clever by focusing on the bigger picture, the bigger thing about freedoms and children and family. Stonewall now seems to be much less canny about, about how they're putting their new forces. It seems that they're not doing let's be as broad as possible, but actually let's be really narrow and not allow any debate. So is that a good analysis, and how did it happen, do you think?
Well, I think that it's part of a bigger phenomenon across politics. I mean, I think what you've got is, you can see it in the States, an absolute absence of collaboration. I mean, even in their case on sort of subcommittees or whatever, at least in the British Parliament, and notwithstanding what Shireen was saying about the Scottish Parliament, there is nonetheless collaboration cross-party. We've lost, I think, in politics, we've lost in academia, that we were talking about this morning, this sweep of an ideological sweep, which does not allow agreement. And I think there are two elements to it. One, I think it's incredibly narcissistic. I think this whole, do you remember the famous phrase, personal is political? I think one of the problems is that the political has now become personal. In other words, it's all about what I want, So it's all about me. And you look at work, and it's all about my well-being. And you go, well, hang on a second. What role does I want play in the achievement of anything? So I think there's something that's going on there, which is, it's in a sense, politics has been washed through therapy. And this is a very middle-class thing, by the way. You don't find, I was saying earlier on, that, it's like, Joan Rivers used to have a joke about UFOs. She said they always land on the grass in Boston. They never land in a cornfield in Idaho, This is quite a middle-class thing. This is a desire to see the world entirely through your own eyes. Actually, sometimes people say, stay in your own lane, a phrase I cannot bear, which means you can only talk about yourself. And then I think, I do quite like that. But so I think there's a theme of subjectivity here, the idea I feel. So this notion of I feel unsafe, that is a subjective feeling. It's something that then has to be measured up against objective fact. So what I'm saying is I think there are a series of things. I also think that the rejection of the left early on of identity politics, both in terms of race and in terms of feminism and subsequently in terms of lesbian and gay politics, we never found a place in the left. It was always reluctant. And because the left was where human rights by and large was talked about, then what happened was the growth of identity movements. And instead of them then being part of a bigger solution, so the personal is political was invented by a bunch of lesbians called the Combahee River Collective in Boston. Instead of that being part of the idea that personal stories were part of a bigger solution, the personal stories become it now. And the identity politics suggests that your personal experience is the experience by which you do politics. So what I'm saying is that I think Stonewall's a symptom of all of that. I think there are things where Stonewall's been taken over. It's ironic that we're in the Whittle room. Anybody who knows the history of Stephen Whittle and the way in which they've injected that ideology into organisations, he is a major architect of it. So what I'm saying is that coincidence things, and I think Stonewall is prey to that, and didn't have and doesn't have the political experience to realise that when they'd got everything done, there was a strategic pivot. They needed to say, what do we do now? And the obvious thing would have been to devolve and build those alliances at a local level, so when the schools in Birmingham controversy
devolve
happened...
in a geographic sense?
Devolve in a geographic sense. So when what happened in Birmingham happened, you'd built the alliance of people around legitimate sex education schools, or whatever. So I think it's a symptom, is my point. But what it's done is it's driven itself into a cul-de-sac, and I don't know how it'll get out of it, actually.
Do you think there's a way back for Stonewall? Are you still involved?
I don't know. It's a bit like asking, is the way back for the Tory party, isn't it, really? I mean, do you know what I mean? You never know. I wouldn't predict.
So moving on then to one of your new roles with your company, Diversity by Design. What brought you into? I mean, it's quite a departure, is it not, from your early career, journalism, comedy, and then moving into basically, is it management consultancy, or what got you there?
What we do is we help people get to the root of what they could usefully do in relation to diversity. And actually, in a way, for me, it's not a huge departure. A lot of it's about advocacy, to be frank. So here's some suggestions about things. The thing about, diversity, inclusion, whatever, these chairs are really bizarre. Either you're kind of lounging on the beach like this, or, you're kind of sat on the edge like, you're a child on a potty. It's incredibly difficult. Anyway, that's a few distinctions. So, this notion of diversity, it's about difference. We wouldn't talk about diversity and inclusion unless it was about difference. Yet what's happened to it is it's transmogrified into a set of rules. So curiously and ironically, diversity has become a tool of conformity, the imposition of rules. Now, the reason I make that point is that when we talk to companies, one of the things I say to them is I say, no, look, there is a fundamental human condition, and that is that you cannot see the world through anybody else's eyes. You can't walk in somebody else's shoes. You cannot experience the world in the way somebody else does. What you can do is attempt to do so, but in a certain knowledge that you never will. That is why we talk about diversity. It is the attempt to understand each other in the certain knowledge that you won't, but understanding their differences so you can collaborate. And anybody who's in a relationship will know that. I mean, don't you wake up in the morning sometimes, look at your partner and think, I have no idea who you are. And other days you wake up and you think, I know exactly who you are. You know, that fun. I mean, my husband's Nigerian, so he's Nigerian, I'm British. And so he's African and I'm European, so he's black and I'm white. And he's religious, I'm not religious at all. In fact, he's a Muslim and I'm absolutely not a Muslim. And he's 26 years younger than me. And whenever I tell people that set of facts, they always say the same thing, which is, how do you deal with the age gap? But what I think is interesting about that response is, we've all got those headlines, right? Ours are just very big. They're just very obvious. So that's one thing. Difference lies at the heart of this. So we spend our time saying to companies, you've got a common objective. Diversity is about identifying difference, not in a sort of big group way. That matters, but also in a way that understands what people bring through their stories. We all bring things that we've learned as we've grown up in the way that we've grown up. So that's number one. The thing with diversity, though, its narrative started in relation to the deficits. In other words, the prejudice or the discrimination that certain groups of people experience. That's very important to understand. But let's be clear. Women, BAME, LGBT. What does this describe? Somebody said to me the other day, you know, are you LGBT? I said, well, you can't be all of them. You know? So what does that describe? Now, it's valuable when CEOs ring me up the whole time and say, we need more women. And I say to them, well, let's pop out in the high street and get 6 assorted then. And they go, I don't mean that. And I go, look, I know you don't mean that. But what do you mean? In other words, the question is, what will altering the balance of men and women in that particular bit of your business enable that bit of your business to do what it wants to do better? So we spent our time saying to people, value difference and understand, see it, value it, and learn how to combine it. Because otherwise you end up just doing, you say blah, blah, blah. Diversity improves our decision-making. You blah, 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 blah. All that stuff. You know, we put people at the centre and all that. So we spent a lot of time, and it's accuracy for me, because you've got to understand the deficits. Because BAME, what does that mean? Well, it means something when people are experiencing racism about the fact that they're not white. Then it means that that is a coherent category. But beyond that, it doesn't have much coherence in terms of the range of families, cultures, geographies, backgrounds, etc. So we spent a lot of time really saying exactly why you're doing it. What's the point of this? Because if you do that, then what you have to do is you have to start being accurate. So an example. The Royal Academy of Engineering, which we are not working with, and when I tell you the story, you'll realise why we won't work with them, or won't end up working with, they won't want to work with us. So I'm on a panel, and we're distributing BEI's money, you know, the business ministry down the road. And they've got money, which they've given to the Royal Academy of Engineering for diversity projects in engineering. So one university, won't say which, Edinburgh, put in an application. And you have to say who your beneficiary group is. And they put in an application which was determined, the beneficiaries of which was going to be people who identify as women. And I said in the panel, I said, look, here's the thing. Whatever I might or might not think about that whole debate, I think you've got an evidence problem here. We know that women and girls are discriminated against in relation to science and engineering between the ages of 8 and 11, when girls and boys choose STEM subjects, whether or not girls go to university to study STEM subjects, and whether girls and young women go into engineering as a profession. We know, the evidence tells us that. Now, there may well be discrimination against trans women in relation to engineering, fine. But actually, it's a meaningless category to just bump them all together. And of course, what they do is they say, no, I'm sorry, we take a very inclusive view of what a woman is. And I go, well, clearly you don't, because that is actually quite an excluding view, blah, blah, blah. But set aside the argument about that, there's an evidentiary problem. So I would say, echo what the panel said, is in your workplace, challenge the evidence the whole time. Ask about the legitimacy of the category. When they say LGBT, Because what organisations do, they think they're being right. We'll set up an LGBT group. And then we'll ask them what the LGBT opinion is. Well, no. As we were saying before, the point is there's a range of opinions. So in your work, ask for the evidence of what are they trying to understand by gathering data around a particular category? Why are they doing that? Therefore, can we understand the different voices? And so chase that through rigorously.
Yeah, I think if you can just drill down a bit on that, because I think it comes to one of the nubs of the problem, which is workplace LGBTQ plus groups and their influence. And I just get the impression, it's a long while since I've been in a workplace, thank God, but I get the impression there's a bit of a hierarchy of victimhood. And when I was at the Tory conference, only Tory conference, the only party that lets us in at the moment, and this young Muslim woman lesbian came up to me and she said, you know, even in my, you know, mosque and the imams say, you know, it's not enough now, lesbians way down, Muslim way down, you're not enough of a victim. The real victims are trans people, and you're kind of at the back of the queue. And it worries me that, you know, this LGBTQ plus, I mean, look at the BBC with their very influential LGBTQ plus group. It seems that the LGB bit has been really quite silenced. Well, and how do you cope with that? Because you're a very fair person, Simon, and always going for the fair thing. But how do you cope with that when you're at the bottom of the pile?
Well, I think there's one thing, which is to point out, again, back to this category thing. What am I measuring and what am I trying to understand? Because if you're going to confuse personal identity with the material reality of discrimination, you're not going to understand discrimination properly. In other words, people are not discriminated against on the basis of their personal identity. When they hit you, it's because you're a puff or a leather. You know, the whole point about prejudice is not very clever. They're the knuckle draggers. Do you know what I mean? They're not. No one's asking your pronouns when they thwack you. Do you know what I mean? They aren't clever. Prejudice is not clever. So the first thing, I think, is to understand what it is that you're trying to describe at that point. And the other thing is this deficit-dividend thing. You've got the diversity deficits and the diversity dividends. If everything's seen in terms of this group of people, and that group is defined in terms of discrimination or victimhood or disadvantage, you do two things. One is you fail to acknowledge the progress that has been made. And secondly, what you do is you imprison people in that group. And the whole point about labels is they're supposed to be springboards of difference. They're not prisons of sameness. So we didn't fight Stonewall, so we were all the same. We fought Stonewall in order all to be different. When the Pankhursts fought for women's vote, they won partial women's vote, and then what happened to the four of them? Atheist, communist, conservative, Catholic. I mean, they fascist. You know, they completely diverged politically, but what they were interested in was the women's vote. So what I'm saying is that in work, it is really important to challenge what people think they're describing when they do that, because they do it from good motives. They think, oh, we'll set up an LGBTIA, you know, blah, blah, blah. My favourite one is two-spirit. Have you come across this? This is something invented in the 80s to describe Native American genders and sexualities. This was the idea. Soho House has just opened in Brighton, and when they sent out the membership form, they asked you whether you're identified as two-spirit. And I did think to myself, I wonder how many of the Pawnee and the Sioux in North London are paying the 1,500 quid, you know what I mean? So my point is that you have to move away from this notion of just being... The group may describe parts of our existence, but they don't define us. Prejudice may be an everyday event, but it's no longer an all-day event. So what you also have to balance is people's aspirations and ambitions. And that lesbian Muslim woman, I mean, she may just be a fucking great engineer. You know, obviously being lesbian, being a Muslim is going to bring a story and an approach. So it's what you bring through that that's really important. Give you another example is disability. So people think, I know she wants to say something, but what the hell? They didn't come to see you, love, they came to see me. Just this example about disability. So disability. And I don't want to be kind of, you know, Heidi swinging her plats about this, but people in wheelchairs. I'm always saying to engineering companies and engineering departments, employ people in wheelchairs because they have a wholly different view of the way in which we use space. They will expand our idea. And the great example of this are curb drops. So in 1962, lovely guy, Rob Harris went to Stanford and campaigned for curb jobs. He slept in an iron lung. He had polio when he was 14. He was an amazing man. Became the father of independent living in the States. Campaigned for curb jobs. Changed streets across the world. And the number of people who use those who are in wheelchairs is tiny. So, it's trying to do that the whole time, seeing what people used to see as victimhood, seeing that as not elevating it, but seeing that story as what you bring to work and therefore a contribution that you can make.
And you're talking there about individuals in the workplace, or are you talking about employers when you say challenge, the challenge definitions and the rest of it? Because I think it seems to me that people in the workplace are quite scared of challenging the orthodoxy of the, say, LGBTQ plus group because they're accused of bigotry if you don't fall into line. And so as individuals in that situation, as opposed to employers who should be looking more broadly, as individuals, what do you do? And added to that, what do you do about using other people's pronouns or being asked to put your pronoun at the bottom of... At what point does that come coercion? At what point do you have to be a bit, angry and just say, I'm not going to do that?
Yeah, there are two or three things here. I think there's a thing about what you do as an employer and how you lead in such a way that absolutely understands and emphasizes this notion of difference, so that you don't use diversity as uniformity, you use it as the flowering of difference. And you say to your company or your team, our ability to, I call them spaces that are safe for disagreement, not safe from disagreement. Psychological safety is not about not having disagreement, it's about having disagreement in a way that's good. So as a manager or as a leader, what you need to do is set up that thing that says, I recognize the difference of voices in the space. So therefore, when I'm the chief executive or the HR director and I set up the LGBTQIA plus two-spirit thingy group, actually I recognize that is a diverse group of people, and I make that explicit in the way that I set it up. So I don't operate, what you're also saying, though, which is what does the individual do? And that is fantastically difficult because actually, as Kathleen experienced and talked earlier on, and as Shireen did as well, when you stick your head above the parapet in an institution that actually is, in a sense, captured by that, it is really, really hard. And I can't say anything other than it is really, really hard. But I will say one thing, which they all said, and I absolutely echo. The more you do it in a way that you're fairly clear about and you work out what it is you want to say, you will find it's an enormous relief. Because what you feel is, as I think Shireen said, she felt that she was somehow morally coherent in some, or maybe it was Kathleen. So I would say that speaking up is a question, I think, of saying gently to people, I have another view. And I know this. People say, oh, that's a bit wibbly-wobbly, and in the end we have to make a decision. Yeah, but you have to start with this idea that the exchange of ideas is fundamental to organizations. You don't get innovation, you don't get any of that. And you worked in television. If you just wrote out a whole set of opinions, you wouldn't get great stories. And I think there's a difference. I mean, I also think you should just simply say, I don't do pronouns because I don't believe that I have a gender identity. And actually, I'm simply going to say that. And that's it, and the end of it. Whenever people ask me, I just think you have to do that, really. And the imposition of it, and I'm always saying to execs and HRDs, do not impose it. Because it is like putting at the bottom of your email, Hail Jesus or something. And when people ask me, my pronouns, I haven't put this at the bottom of my email yet, my pronouns are get her. So... But don't impose it. So I think the rules here are that try and find other people who agree with you and say in those LGBT groups or whatever, actually there is a different view here.
It sounds to me, Simon, what you're saying is almost like a two-stage process in that you've got to help employers who are sometimes just quite lazy about it. Oh, well, the new thing is LGBTQ+, we'll make sure that's in place. And then they leave it to whatever happens after that. If one group takes predominance in it, then that's bad luck. So there's the employer being less lazy and understanding it's a diverse thing, but then there's the individual who has the courage to say something like, I really do not want to put my pronouns at the bottom of my emails, but that could be quite dangerous for that employee.
Well, as Kathleen
in
said,
this atmosphere.
Yes, I mean, that academic question is, you know, and I'm sorry, we're in a battle about this, and actually there are risks, and when you're in an organisation, there just are. There's nothing I can say to make that feel better, I think.
Yeah.
It just is the truth of it. But I think it is this thing of saying to them, difference matters. And actually, this notion of spaces that are safe for disagreement rather than from, you know, this thing about I feel safe. You know, I always find this extraordinary. You know, the internet has this thing, don't they, where difference is seen as hostility and it's not embraced. Disagreement is not embraced. And people talk about words as literal violence. I think words are literally not violence. They are literally the opposite of violence. Violence is an action. And I always say to people, if words were actions, then every time you said fuck, you'd actually have an orgasm. And I tell you what, our builder would never leave his house. I mean, you know, so you really do have to challenge these ideas. Yes, you may feel that, but actually we listen to your subjective experience. And then what we do, we have to reach a group solution.
Can I just say, I'd quite like to get some just
thoughts,
questions or thoughts or experiences from the audience, because I think now we've got Simon here, we can ask him lots of difficult things or give him some information that you have.
Yeah, I will challenge you. Tell us some stories. So, for goodness sake. There's a lady in the front there in the pink.
And the guy there, and then thank you very much.
Thank you.
I was thinking about...
if you hold the microphone closer up, I know. No, don't put it in your mouth. Just hold it close to your mouth. I'm rather hoping you're a lesbian, so stop it.
I am a lesbian. I was recalling, just flitting through about companies, when the women's liberation movement started, way back when, and when I also was in GLF, 1971, we had this thing called consciousness raising. And what we did in groups was we came from all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of life experiences. But what we did was we sat down, and in our diversity we talked about our experiences, and we didn't abuse each other, or if someone was a Catholic, but we found a consensus, and we realized that what we were all suffering were certain kinds of oppression that came down to this. And it allowed the movement to flourish. I mean, people did all kinds of things, abortion rights, equal pay. Blah, blah. They didn't have to agree, but they made tremendous contributions, as we know. And I think that's the kind of thing that's just disappeared out the window.
I think you've hit on something very important. I use this when I do sort of workshops or whatever. The first thing I ask people to do is to split into groups, into pairs rather, and find 3 or 4 differences between each other that they bring to work. From their background, their family, their upbringing, their whatever. Tell those stories and understand the difference. And it's incredible. It takes off when you do it. So one of the things I would say is, drawing on exactly that, is if you get people to tell their personal stories, you've then got a starting point for having the kind of much more human relationship. And it takes you away, doesn't it, from that standoff, because you politically want this and I politically want that. And I think that I would say that, spend time in teams and departments, ask to tell stories and ask to understand. Because the other thing is, there's this, talking about your hierarchy, there's this idea that, you know, if you're lesbian or gay or black or Asian or whatever, you know, you've got a story. But if you're a straight white bloke, you haven't got a story. Well, actually, I was walking down the corridor once in Coots. We worked with a fantastic guy who had the best business card ever. He could, head of wealth. Isn't that great, you know? And he was fantastic. It's called Rupert, obviously, because he worked at Coots. He doesn't work at Coots anymore. He's a fantastic bloke. Anyway, walking down the corridor, and he suddenly does this. And I went, oh, you're all right. And he was like, terrible pain. He had suffered incredible pain right the way through his career from an early rugby injury. Actually, it had really damaged him in his 30s, and he'd had to take time off. He was always a big supporter of lesbian and gay things, and I could never quite know why. And when he told me that story, I suddenly realised. I said, oh, you've come out, haven't you? And he'd come out to his boss, taken time off, recovered, and come back to work. So I can't bear this phrase allies either. Because I always feel like I'm being pushed across the road, in the pedestrian crossing in a wheelchair by a burly heterosexual. You know what I mean? Everybody's got difference. Everybody's got those stories. I think you're absolutely right. That's how you find the commonality and, crucially, the differences.
Great, thank you for that. Next question.
Well,
there's a few.
There's a few there. There's a lady in a red shirt
keep your
back
answers
there.
short, Simon.
She knows what she's talking about.
So,
hello.
You do know who that is, don't you?
We do.
Hello, love.
Hi, I'm Maya Forstatter.
Who's that?
Basically, it's like saying Expelliarmus. You just say my name at work, and it makes the Dementors go away. I've heard it works. I wanted to do a little ask of the audience, which is Sex Matters is trying to find out people's experience at work, and we're doing the first big survey of people's experience of being gender critical at work, whether that's good, bad, whether you've been in conflict with your employer, or whether you've made it work, and whether the Forstatter judgment has helped you. So pick up a postcard and do the survey. Sorry, is that all right?
That's great, thank you. It's like him selling his book. Lady at the front, there's a couple of, and then we'll go to the back. We'll go back.
I think Eileen's saying here.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. That was really, really brilliant. One of the things I've done at work, and I have been in senior roles, so it's easier, is not insist that nobody uses LGBTQI+, because it leads to really bad policy making. I work in health and social care. You bunch that together, you get the wrong answer. I make the staff separate out. So they have to talk about this policy, how does it affect lesbians? This policy, what does it mean for gay men? And I just do it all the time. All the time. So.
Really,
I mean, if you think that, you're absolutely right. If you think what are our policies for the company on lesbians and gays, they're all about partnership. If people are transitioning, it's all about healthcare. You know, and also this thing. I got sent a leaflet the other day from Canada. I must just tell you this was
Canada.
It's from Canada, and it was for an inclusiveness workshop, and the people who were invited were LGBT, TTI, QQ, PPAA, lesbian, gay, genderqueer, bisexual, transsexual, transvestite, two-spirit, queer questioning, pansexual, polyamorous, asexual, allies. I mean, what the fuck are the allies doing there? I mean, they're the people who are not the rest. The only people who aren't invited to this workshop are two men on Top Sex at the Weekend, homophobes in Surrey. I mean, it is completely... It's bonkers. And so, accuracy, I think that's the thing. Accuracy.
It's a really good practical suggestion.
Wonderful, thank you.
Great one. We'll give you. Any more questions? I think we'll go over to the side so as not to show bias. One of you there.
Hi, thanks. It's Jo Phoenix here.
Jo Phoenix, ladies and gentlemen, another terrific stander-upper.
It's a question that probably is driven a little bit by personal experience, just a little bit. To what extent do you think that the leaders in some of our larger organisations are bailing on doing anything about this by just allowing employees to slug it out through the grievance process?
I think it's one of the big difficulties is that if you're running a big organisation at the moment and what you're faced with is, for instance, even recently, I mean, the level of inflation, you know, the lack of markets as a result of Brexit, etc., huge labour shortages, skills shortages, so on and so forth. So I think that's absolutely right. I mean, they've got massive issues that you think of, and frankly, actually, no. Could HR please go and do this? So I think that's it. I don't think it just happens actually though through that process, although that's often where it ends up is in the grievance process. I think the effect of it is they just let people get on with it, a bit in the way you were saying. So, and there's this sort of bowing down in front of. And they should be brave enough to stand up and say, is that the single view, and so on and so forth. But leaders are ducking it. There is no doubt about that. I spoke to the vice-chancellors the other day, all of them. I don't know what you call a group of vice-chancellors. I don't know what you call them, you know, a gaggle, a refusal. So I talked to them, and it was really interesting. They did divide into 3 groups of people. And I was
Denial.
talking about this kind of crisis of exchange of... And I call it exchange of ideas, by the way. I don't call it academic freedom. Academic freedom does have a kind of legislative... it's a building block. But I talk about the exchange of ideas because I think that helps us to say this is... You can't just say anything. The key thing is you say stuff and you put it out to challenge on a peer-reviewed basis. And you're an academic, so you live in that world. So I think the key thing is that we've somehow got to get leaders to understand that the exchange of ideas is central to their growth and success and prosperity of their companies or institutions. And that if they continue to duck this, we have a serious crisis, particularly in universities, but not just. We have a serious crisis in innovation across business. So my pitch to them is, the reason you talk about diversity is in order to grow what people can bring into your business and how they can collaborate. I don't start with BAME, LGBT, whatever. I start with that.
Now, I've only got 5 minutes left. So the woman there with the stripy jumper?
Thank you. I'm in a very unusual position because I actually work for a Russell Group University as an equalities advisor. So being very much second wave feminist, gender critical, I say no to people a lot. Like, no, we're not going to take the word mother out of our maternity policy. No, we're not going to make every toilet and changing facility gender neutral. So sometimes it's quite a lonely position to be in, but I suppose I just want to share a couple of insights I have from that perspective, and I think it's very much backing up what Simon was saying. So I always bring it back to the law, bring it back to the Equality Act, what is a protected characteristic and what isn't. And I also bring it back to the evidence base. So when I have got lots of people coming to me saying, there's this issue, there's that issue, I want you to do this, I want you to do that, it's not about who shouts the loudest. It's about going back to our data. And we have very good data. We ask about sex, and the only possible answers are male or female. We do ask about gender identity, because we know that is important to some of our staff. But one of the responses that you can give is, I do not have a gender identity, in the same way that you can say, I do not have a religion or belief when we ask you about your religion. Thank you. And when we go back to the evidence base, that really shows us where our issues are. So 50% of undergraduates are female, only 28% of the professors at my university are female. That concerns me. The experience of our disabled staff who score really lowly in our staff surveys, that concerns me. A minority of people who are very, very noisy, but make up less than 1% of our 8,000 staff body. It concerns me to an extent, but the data enables me to say, hold on, I actually need to give my attention to these issues.
Would you come and speak to me afterwards? I really want to pick your brain. Would you do that?
Oh, I would love to, yeah.
Thank you.
That'd be great. I think we've got time for 1, maybe 2 questions. Is there anything I've ignored? There we go.
How do we persuade people, especially senior leaders in organisations, that trans rights and gender identitarianism are not gay 2.0? They've witnessed discrimination against lesbians and gays, early in their career. They've saw how we had to fight or beg for our rights. And they think, now, let's be kind for the trans, let's roll out the red carpet, let's enable everything. And if any of us dare to complain, we're almost treated as if, it's the alphabet soup arguing amongst itself, and it's really bad manners of us to complain about this. How do you get them to not see it that way?
Okay, the risk of sounding like I'm plugging, because I am. But what I tried to do in the book, which is over there, I tried to make a more general case. In other words, what I was saying to leaders is that this question of difference, this question of diversity, is genuinely fundamental to your business, but only if you apply it accurately. In other words, if you really understand difference. So the crucial thing is, I'll tell you a story about a lovely trans activist called Jackie Gavin, who started the Civil Service Agenda group. And Jackie and I did a panel one day. And I went first, and then she went second, and we chatted to each other because we would find something interesting. And then we threw it open to the crowd, and then somebody in the front row, about the third question, this woman said, I don't know what to do, misgendering, misnaming, dead naming, it's all confusing me, oh my God. And Jackie, who's very funny Glaswegian, she leapt forward, she said, well, first thing, dear, is calm down. You need to know that before Jackie was Jackie, she was called Scott. That was her name. Okay, she was born as Scott. She also is a Scot, but she was born, her name was Scott. And then she said this extraordinary thing. She said, I wouldn't be here, she said, if it wasn't for Scott's bravery. She said, Scott is part of me. I carry him everywhere I go. And the audience just embraced it, this story. And whenever Jackie posts, she'll post pictures of Scott and pictures of Jackie, so Trans Visibility Day. She tells her story. So I think the way to convince leaders is to say, this is a much bigger question. Don't just get trapped in the gay, trans. This is not a debate about trans people or whatever. This is a bigger issue for you as leaders that you need to grasp, which is it's the difference that people have. It's not that trans women are women. Much richer story is Jackie's story that trans women are trans women and women are women. That's a much richer territory. And when you start saying that to leaders and say, look at your staff, how are you going to draw on all their different stories in order to enable them to collaborate, in order to do whatever it is you do? Once you start that narrative and stop diversity being a minority sport, you start to shift the debate away from, oh, you're just being horrible to trans people. You're saying, no, actually, I'm being exactly the opposite. I am valuing their story, I'm valuing my story, and I'm valuing that black, that Asian, that whatever story. Do you see what I mean? So generalize that case, I think, into this fundamental idea, which is the basis of being human, is we don't understand each other, but we need to.
I think, Simon, that's a really powerful place to end. Sorry, I'm really... Thank you, audience, for your brilliant insights and your questions. I'm sure Simon's going to be available throughout lunchtime to talk to people and hear your stories as well. So thank you very much. And
do pop over and buy a book and chat. It'd be
buy
lovely.
a book. And thank you, Simon, once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Eileen.